So this is the fourth chapter of, or the fourth essay in Hans Jonas's Phenomenon of Life. We're going to start first with a couple addenda to the previous essay. In the first appendix in the previous essay, he elaborated a little on this idea of the mathematization of nature, which he thought was markedly different in the ancient Greek conception compared to the modern conception, though he really focuses primarily on the Pythagorean tradition and its influences, so as far as I could tell. And this point he tries to make is that the Greeks, they didn't look really for dynamics or for changes in the universe. They were looking for these static ordering forms, these structural wholes, which had a certain inherent purposefulness in them. The way they define them is pretty much by reducing them to the ratio of their parts and the ratios which they found themselves within. So these ratios, they constituted the essences of the things or their logos. For example, the musical interval of the octave was defined by the ratio of 2 to 1. So since these ratios weren't limited just to particular things, could be transposed, could be found analogously in different kinds of things, the idea arose of this more all-encompassing, comprehensive principle of proportion in itself, which came to be this comprehensive logos, which was a kind of ordering principle or matrix within which all these other wholes are contained and ordered. The Greek is essentially looking at a whole of wholes, and when he's describing them, he's again not looking for the dynamics and the changes of that the parts are involved in, but at these broader structures, the ratios of the structures, essentially the morphology, the morphological features, the geometric and arithmetic features of the wholes. And from this viewpoint, the various movements and changes are really kind of minimized in their dynamic nature. They're really just kind of morphological features of a stable whole. I guess an important point here is that the Greek is never really interested in trying to explain. No, he is interested, but not primarily interested in trying to explain the parts. Contrary to what we're trying to do, we're analyzing and studying the parts to try to come up with some kind of a theory that connects them. He is trying to understand this connective thing, this logos, this comprehensive principle first, and then to try to fit the facts within that. And we can see that with, for example, with the way the logos is also kind of selective, because they always preferred rational numbers and finitude in the way they conceptualized these ratios. And this, we can see this in, for example, the Aristotelian and the Ptolemaic and the Copernican notions or insistence on trying to find these perfect circles in the movements of the heavenly bodies rather than the ellipses which we eventually move towards. So this is on the Greek notion of mathematization. Then he kind of mentions Whitehead, and which he thinks produced important, great ideas, and kind of showed us a way of avoiding dualism, not by extending death to an entire universe as the mechanicist materialists would do, but by extending life. However, Jonas thinks that the distinctions might have blurred too much at this point. For example, it's very difficult to understand the notion of death, which is crucial to the understanding of life within this Whiteheadian framework of a universe which is endlessly self-realizing, endlessly self-creating itself. And finally, there's this point about how organic identity might be constituted on a more physical level, given the fact that the parts of cells as well as the cells themselves are constantly regenerating themselves or being replaced. And he thinks that this identity could be, in a way, located or maintained in these networks of nerve cells or the DNA in nerve cells, which would trace a skeleton of identity. I'm not really sure how up-to-date these ideas are or how fresh they were at his time, So we can, maybe someone from the biological life sciences can inform us better what the state of the matter is. But to move to the key part of this chapter, to the meat of the chapter, Hans Jonas wants to differentiate animals from plants, and he sees that the key features of animals is their mobility, their perception, but also their emotions, all of which are rooted in the same principle, which we are going to get to soon. They all also express the same basic openness towards the world, which is present in all kinds of life forms, which we can see, which is demonstrated already in the basic irritability of the cell, which is the condition of it having a world, and which is then maintained on these higher levels. But with the animal, with the differentiation of its motor abilities, the differentiation of its perceptive abilities, the central nervous system, this openness becomes more complex. The animal gains the ability to integrate its various feelings, its various perceptions. It has these, what Jonas says, the beginnings of an objective world, and it also has consequently a greater freedom in the way it goes about meeting its basic needs. Just a second, because my iPad kind of froze up. Okay. So at this point, the animal is really transcending itself on two levels, forward and outward. There's this outer level of space. The animal has to get towards its goals on which it is dependent. It has to be able to perceive them at a distance, and this creates its space of freedom. There's also this dimension, which Jonas is kind of focusing on here, of the inner temporal level, with the animal having to get not from one place to another to meet its goals, but from one moment to another, from its present state towards its goal. And this level is usually neglected because it's harder to see, and this is where emotionality actually takes place. Why do we need emotionality? Why are emotions necessary? It's because animals have to pursue their prey, or they have to flee from their predators. They have to go out into the world and look for their food, for the things they need. And for this, it's not enough to be able to perceive these things that are at a distance. It's not enough to be able to just move there. You need also something that motivates the animal to overcome the spatial and temporal distance that separates it from the goal. And this is basically appetition, it's a desire, it's emotions in general. The role of perception, as I have it here on the slide, is basically says that its goal, the goal of the animal is not here, it's there. Desire tells it that it's not yet, but could be soon. And mobility is basically what allows it to make it this goal here and now. And of course, the greater this distance, and I guess the more complex this distance is, the more obstacles it contains, the more the greater the complexity of the animal is going to have to be able to overcome it. What underlies all these aspects of the animal is a certain immediateness of its existence. So of course, all animals have all living beings have some kind of environment. Plants, when we look at plants, they are integrated and merged and in an immediate touch with their environment. They're in the same context with it, and therefore they're able to get their food pretty much immediately. They can synthesize it from the nutrients which are immediately available in its immediate vicinity. They have neither the need nor the opportunity to move to get to their food because it's already available, which has important implications for the way the plant or some kind of life form is going to evolve, what evolutionary pathways are going to be open to it. In essence, the plant can execute its basic vital self-care, its basic care for itself immediately. Whereas with the animal, it is no longer in this immediate touch. Its goals are no longer right next to it. It has to get to them, so it has to mediate this way towards them. Of course, both in this spatial sense, on the first level, which I mentioned before, and on this temporal sense. They have to be the physical distance, but they also have to be this temporal distance, which is, for example, particularly obvious with carnivores, which have to hunt for their food, which is mobile, and this adds further challenges and demands a greater, for example, mobility from the animal which is pursuing. So the animal needs these intermediate steps. They are on the one hand possible, they become possible, this realm of freedom becomes possible, but they're also, these intermediate steps are also necessary to get to this basic vital self-maintenance. The animal needs the detour, which opens up this realm of freedom, but this realm of freedom also brings with it dangers and uncertainty, because its success as it tries to get to its goals is actually not assured for it. As Jonas writes, the arc of its detour is the locus of the freedom and risk of animal life. The outward motion is an expenditure to be redeemed only by the eventual success, but this success is not assured. So the animal heads out into the world to get its food, but it also has to flee from the world if it is food for someone. The world is consequently both inviting for it, but also threatening. And the animal has no real stable place for itself in the world. It's exposed, it has to be alert, it has to notice things that are happening around it. It can't simply relax and simply be dormant like a plant. And it also has to desire to get to the goals that it needs to maintain itself. And these desires are, again, the emotions which Jonas brought up. So appetition is, appetition is basically the expression of the most basic care of life, which we find even in the simpler life forms, but it's a differentiation of that. And emotions are basically the function of this basic care of life for itself, which is why Jonas says, animal being is thus essentially passionate being. Of course, these discussions often open up these questions, whether one kind of life form is superior or inferior, whether it is better off or worse off because of some capabilities or some pitfalls that it finds itself in because of these capabilities. Because on the one hand, the animal, of course, can move. It has this freedom of movement, but this also opens it up to these dangers and anxieties and restlessness. Its survival, in a certain sense, seems to be more difficult than, say, than the survival of a plant. But Jonas thinks that rating things in this manner purely based on this survival criterion is not really a good way of looking at life, because in the end, all life is essentially faces this precarious, vulnerable, uncertain state. As he says, life is essentially precarious and corruptible being, an adventure in mortality, and in no possible form as assured of enduring as an inorganic body can be. So similarly, he thinks we shouldn't really think about emotions, perceptions, and so forth merely in terms of their survival value. They're not just the means of the continuance of this metabolic entity, but they are the ends. They are actually part of what is being continued and maintained. With all this comes also greater individuality, which of course we've already had in a certain sense, this sense of selfhood, which emerges with the autonomous freedom of the basic organism. But with the development of the central nervous system and these more sophisticated perceptive and more motor abilities, we have an opening up of the environment with possibilities and dangers, but also an opening up of this inner dimension of selfhood. A more pronounced self is set over against a more pronounced world. We have, on the one hand, with the animal, the ability to experience pleasure, but it also has as its flip side, as its shadow, this suffering, which is constantly haunting it. It may desire satisfaction, but it also dreads self-destruction. But also, we have the animal is, in a certain sense, becomes isolated, it becomes lonely because it's somewhat at a remove from the world, but it also enables both the need and the possibility of sophisticated forms of communication. And finally, we have this idea which emerges here is an ever greater divide between the subject and the object, which kind of is present from the most basic level of organisms, but here really starts to be accentuated. There seems to be this gap between the organism and its environment, which it has to find various ways of facing with. It looks for various modes to face with this, what Jonas calls this lost unity. And for example, emotions are one way of how it tries to bridge the challenges that emerge with its particular life form. And now for some questions which emerge for me personally, and maybe we can discuss them, maybe not. There's this idea that having certain features might open up or close certain evolutionary pathways, although they might not be immediately related. I think this is very interesting when it comes to humans, for example, or consciousness and or language abilities, which might not have evolved as specifically fit adaptations, but merely as side products of some other kind of evolutionary pathway. Then there's the question of whether animals have really the beginnings of an objective world. I'm not sure what this really means. So what does it mean to have the beginnings of an objective world? Do they conceive of objects, or do they conceive of something else? And what is it that they actually have in their world? Then also 3 questions which are pretty much interrelated. I'm wondering on what level is Jonas talking about this mediacy? So is it just the external observer trying to determining that the animal is at a remove from its world, that it has to mediate to find some kind of connection or to function again? Or is this also the case? Or is this also a feature of its actual experience? Does the animal know that its existence is mediate? Or is it actually unaware of this and simply living as though its existence was immediate? And of course, I think this question is important for existential implications. If we are aware of this mediacy, what does it mean? What happens to this mediacy? In what sense does its character change? If I know that I'm forced to constantly mediate the world to myself, to, I don't know, interpret it for myself, to manipulate it to serve me, what does this do to the character of the mediacy? But what does this mean for my very existence? And these are some of the ideas which I want to open up. And this is it from my side. It was a pretty short chapter, so I hope I wasn't too short.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, and also the helpful questions that I suppose will definitely help us get a sense of orientation for the discussion. So who would like to kick things off this time?
Well, Primož, thanks for the presentation. Maybe would you try to answer those questions first, or would you outline? I don't know. What are your ideas about that? I'm particularly interested in the question of mediacy. Like, how would you imagine that the animals are aware of the mediacy themselves? Like, what kind of form it would have for an external observer such as ourselves? Because this is beyond my imagination, I think. I'm not sure how to understand or how to imagine this.
Yeah, I'm pretty much from Plessner here, who has these very similar terms, immediacy, indirectness, and so forth. He also thinks in these terms, but the way he puts it is that animals actually live an immediate existence from their own kind of perspective, because they're not aware of their mediation. Of course, they are mediating their reality to themselves via their body, but they're not aware of this. Whereas the human, who has this self-reflexive relation to himself, is able to do just exactly what we're doing right now, to be aware of this, or to think about the fact that you might be mediating your reality to yourself in whatever wide form this might take. So yeah, this is the direction I was thinking about here. I would agree that, yeah, from the outer perspective, from the perspective of the observer, the animal does seem to be doing more of a mediating work compared to a plant. But I don't think this would be, for example, pertinent to the animal itself. I don't think it's bothered by this mediation. Because I feel like Jonas is sometimes using language that seems to suggest as though he's talking about what the animal is actually going through, rather than just what the observer is noticing about what the animal is doing. And this is where I think maybe a distinction should be made. On what level are we observing and deriving these things?
So basically, we wouldn't be speaking about the animal itself, but we would be speaking about the animal within our experience, even though we are speaking about the animal itself, right? Something like that. So it would be the animal itself mediated by our world, something like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have something in mind with regards to this, Jan? Something in the background, like a
No, but because maybe I didn't understand correctly what Primož was intending to say, but yeah, now I think I got the idea, because I thought that I'm hearing that you are suggesting that there would be a way how the animals themselves would be aware of this, they're mediating, but now you're saying probably not, if I understand correctly. Okay.
Yeah, that would be my nice standpoint, but I'm not sure what.
So
where
we are
Jonas
basically kind of
stands.
sticking with the Plessnerian account.
Yeah.
Okay.
Always.
That was my question. Okay, are we somewhere else, or we are happy with the Plessnerian? Yeah.
would you have a different take on this?
No, not really. I think I am incapable of going beyond that. But what I find interesting is that now you're kind of complicating the things in an interesting way by pointing out that all this talk about how the animals mediate their contact with their surroundings is kind of taken from within the human experience, or the human empathy with what's going on, right? So that's interesting for me, right? Because we don't see inside the animal, right? We are empathizing, but this is us. Still, we are speaking about the animals themselves. There's kind of paradox there. And I'm
Yeah, I guess this is what Jonas is doing all along, like even with this conception of life only knowing life, and then this danger of anthropomorphization.
Exactly.
What level do we take this? I'm not sure he's really clear on this account. Like the way he's looking, he's taking in this world and trying to analyze it through this anthropomorphic perspective, but where does he make the distinction how things actually are and how he interprets them?
Yeah.
Because, for example, Plessner, he really tries to take care to kind of put this whole question into the brackets and deal with it at the very end, at the conclusion of his deduction. And Jonas seems to be kind of jumping between different levels. He's treating the thing in itself in a certain sense, but also this is kind of all anthropomorphic, and life only knows life, and we can talk about it because we are alive, so we can kind of imagine the way things might be for others. But of course, what is he really doing when he's saying that the animal has immediate existence? Is he imagining what life is like for the animal, or is he just saying as an external observer that it is doing this, I don't know, on the level of behavior, this mediating work? Or is this a feature of its actual existence?
But I think that go on to
Because I'm also studying the Plesner lectures side by side with this, and I also see the links there. So Plesner also says that we, in becoming aware of the mediation, we still remain very much immersed in it, right? We don't actually step outside of it. So we're still very much in the here and now, and our awareness of the mediation doesn't actually take us outside of the immersion. It happens as a part of it somehow. So in that sense, the awareness of this mediation is something quite paradoxical, because we don't actually exit it. We don't see the mediation, but we somewhere do get a sense of it from within. And I'm also curious of like the layers in which this awareness then bubbles up, because so this awareness of mediation is tied to our self-awareness. And on a very high level, we become philosophically aware of it and of distinctions between the phenomenon and the noumenon, and we express it very theoretically, but on, I guess, a more lived level, it's a different kind of a sense that we get, that my world isn't the world itself, that there is some divergence at play. I'm curious what the nature of this awareness of the mediation actually is.
I think this we can maybe tie this in with I don't remember what essay that was in. I think it was fairly early on when he was talking. I believe it was also in an appendix somewhere about the way that perception hides its own causal origin. And basically, I think that maybe that was the first meeting, appendix to the first chapter. So maybe an awareness of mediacy, so an explicit awareness of mediacy, is precisely an awareness of that sleight of hand done by perception constantly, whereas animals wouldn't be aware of that mediacy per se, because they don't have the sort of reflective distance to understand what perception does in a way. I really no idea if that's helpful at all, but
the thing is, I have the impression that it is precisely if this feature that kind of wreaks havoc in Jonasian approach, because it makes it really unstable. According to this particular idea, you have this causal story, right, which hides itself somehow. But on the other hand, you have a different type of story, which is not strictly causal. So the thing is that you don't really know which one carries the burden of which. So let me try to depict what I mean by this. You could put forward a case, and it would go something along the lines of the aforementioned Plesner, but I don't want to just, kind of refer to the staple name here, but something along the lines of that. There are certain patterns and structures that are given to you, and this is what you have to work with. So what is kind of in one way or another intuitively given to you in a broad sense of the term. And you have to take these categories seriously or not. So you have two possibilities basically. So the scientific approach will discard them. It will say they're somehow a mirage. There are a lot of difficulties with this. So you can go and you can say that there is something to them. But as soon as you accept this, as soon as you accept that there is something to life, such as, say, teleology, or having a certain meaningful relationship to its environment, and having the notion of the need which is related to this fundamental notion of freedom, you're talking a story about yourself as well. So in a certain sense, then, you know, this is how you enter the picture. And it is this reality that you constantly are talking about. So it's not like thing in itself is necessarily something that underpins this particular reality that you're talking of, but you can, within this particular reality, take a certain stance or an attitude, which is, let's say, distinctly human, but it is not exhaustive of the reality itself. It does not negate the reality of the phenomena. This would be one story, regardless of how shaky it is, or it might be, I don't know. But the thing is, he has another story, which is a causal story. And I don't see how these two necessarily fit together. He might maybe say that causal story is a way of accounting for what we are now describing from a very specific perspective. It is not necessarily talking about the reality of things, but it is a way of schematizing things.
When you speak of the causal story, are you referring to this very mysterious passage in the first essay? Where
Yeah, perception.
Yeah, like atoms that build up the full picture, and he gives this kind of a sketchy. Yeah.
So, yeah, where you have like this causal chains, and then they hide themselves. You don't see it. So
I mean,
yeah.
I have two questions here. Like, does this causal world have to necessarily be like elementary particles causal? Because you can still talk about forms, and I think he does. When he's talking about causation, he's talking about forms causing also or having an effect on particles, right? I mean, I don't think he has this very bottom-up causality approach, as far as I understood him. So I think a causal world, or this part of the causal approach still can have like these forms as entities in it, right? And the other thing is that what about thinking about these two approaches as kind of different discourses? So you use the term schematicism, but like basically scientific discourse is a discourse of like segmenting the world, but not one, not the other is really the thing in itself, right? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean,
he doesn't really make the distinction himself, does it? What story he is talking about at any given moment. It's just blurring one into the other.
Maybe one of the problems with this is that he's basically, like he said at the beginning, it's a collection of essays. So maybe the lack of coherence is precisely just switching, you know, from one essay to another, which have a common thread, but he didn't really polish up the connections between them. So, you know, maybe the reason why he's switching is he's switching because we're reading these essays sequentially, but within a given essay, it's not a problem. But he didn't really take care of this question himself. That's one way, like a very beneficial way of reading or yeah, trying to really be kind to what he's doing. I don't know. So my impression is, given his emphasis on the significance of teleology, if you want to understand life and ourselves being living beings, that there is a certain hierarchy in the story that you're going to say about the world. So if you want to say a causal story, you have to be a teleological creature which is able to recognize certain forms that have certain directedness and certain significance. So only within this scheme are you able to then come to efficient causality. That's my impression. He doesn't articulate it, but I have this impression that this is the point that he is trying to kind of convey. So I would assume that if pressed, he would probably say that there is a certain hierarchical structure between these two approaches. So he's definitely not being a Selarsian, which is an implicit question. No?
Okay, so but which of these two? So you would argue that he would ground at the very end in the theological causality, not in the awareness of the phenomenon, or
So I would say that according to him, this is the necessary but not sufficient requisite for this to happen at all. So to have some sort of a vital structure, vital patternedness, or vital dynamism for anything of the sort to happen at all. So for you to be able to anchor it in the domain of meaningful forms, meaningful patterns, you yourself have to be one. And but that's only, I would assume, the beginning of the story. So as we see with Jonas, there is a let's say a progressive story of qualitative leaps that have to do with progressive complexification. So, for example, the realm of reasons or domain of reasons would not be the realm of meaningful patterns in this case. So I'm assuming that, but he's basically doing two things when he's reintroducing life. On the one hand, he's kind of trying to say, look, in the realm of the objects of science, if you do not recognize the specifics of life, you're simply going to miss it. But that's only one thing. The second point is, if you reintroduce life, then your whole theory of knowledge will change as well. Because you will no longer have just these two domains of causality on the one hand, and the domain of reasons. There's like standard debate after the early modern philosophy. But all of a sudden you have this weird domain of vitality, which is neither domain of causes, neither domain of reasons. And for him, it is very strongly related to the domains of means and the domains of meanings related to those means.
Is this domain of means for Jonas like the middle ground that he uses to bridge between these two?
I have a feeling it's like this middle ground is, I mean, kind of rooted in this basic self-concern, like that he talks in this chapter, right? And then that he develops into like a sort of a theory of emotions and needs and desires. So this is kind of the missing dynamic that I feel like he's trying to articulate, I guess. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, can you so what was specifically the question, or the point that you were making?
I mean, we were talking about this purely causal, right?
Yeah.
The realm of causes and the realm of reasons.
Yeah.
Right? And I guess we would say that the realm of reasons is kind of a human affair that is possibly given to us by language or whatnot. And what is this middle ground, right? Between this vitalistic middle ground. What is it? What kind of phenomena do we find in it? And like how does it relate to these two other realms, right? So the realm of reasons and the realm of causes.
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, what he's trying to flesh out is precisely some sort of a domain that is, in a certain sense, categorically a bit of a mishmash or an in-between. So it's a bit of a problem. So, for example, very specifically, in a certain sense, the way he's fleshing out the middle ground is in reference to the Kantian tradition, where you have, on the one hand, you have the domains of reasons, which are related to the domain of freedom, to the domain of autonomy, and then you have the domain of causes, which are the domain of determinism. And there you have the middle strange, whatever it is, which is kind of this minimal freedom, which, however, is always bound by the necessity of having to exchange matter. So you have freedom. The more free it is, the more, in a certain sense, it becomes capricious, so to speak. So the more it becomes bound to the conditions. and the more fragile it becomes. So you have this haphazard freedom, which is freedom, but it's not a Kantian freedom, but at the same time, it's not determined, as you have the realm of causes. So he is trying to kind of carve out a conceptual middle ground and not just say, well, there's an in-between, but really flesh it out. What does it mean? And we see that this is the domain, according to him, of, first of all, metabolism. So this fundamental structure which is related to need. And then he's trying to go further and show that it is basically something that is not static, but is constantly evolving. It is dynamic. It is going through these steps of complexification whereby we get these interesting qualitative shifts. And perception is one of them, motility is one of them, emotion is all of them. We've seen that all of them are interrelated. So a lot of interesting stuff is going on, but my impression is that he is, writing essays. So, for example, when you read this essay, you see how it's related to the former one, but there is no smooth transition. So he's not really rehashing and trying to connect things more smoothly. It's just like we ended here and now we go to this. Yeah. And I think
he does refer sometimes.
Yeah, he does for sure.
But I guess it was just done afterwards.
Yeah.
I talked about that in that essay.
He had to kind of,
revised edition.
Make it cool for the book.
I have two thoughts on this. One is I feel that with this mishmash approach, he's doing something quite valuable. So linking things like meaning and care and concern to metabolism, and stepping between this order of reasons and causes and kind of welding them together with notions like needful freedom and how it's linked to metabolism. I think that's very valuable. But when we then get to these passages where he describes perception as made up of smaller processes that then hide themselves to give rise to what we experience, I feel like the mishmashing also gets a bit sloppy at parts. And he, in those moments, I think loses track of a deeper insight, which I think is much more present in Merleau-Ponty's works, for example, which is that we should start with sort of the pre-objective lived logic of perception itself and understand how our scientific and philosophical investigations follow from that, so that the causal explanation of perception will always remain founded on a deeper layer which it cannot get underneath. So yeah.
But at all, they, consider the fact that Merleau-Ponty's first work was in a certain sense kind of more attuned to this. So he was paving the way to get to the study of the perception in its own logics and dynamics. Now, most people know phenomenology of perception. I would argue strongly that in order for you to get a better grasp as to why phenomenology of perception, because sometimes you have the feeling you've just been thrown into it, or it has just fallen from the sky. If you go through the structure of behavior, he's basically trying to make a case that you have to do it. So what I'm trying to say is, sure, you could say Merleau-Ponty did it better because he started with perception, but he didn't. He didn't start with perception. He started by bashing behaviorists so that he could write a 600-page book on the logic of perception.
Yeah, but then the structure of behavior ends with that very interesting turn, which I don't see in Hans Jonas, where he says that the causal domain cannot get to this deeper logic that we need to get at.
I'm definitely not disputing I have the impression we're not going to forgive him for that appendix. That early appendix, he's just toast. But if we put that weird appendix aside, he has a lot of he does a lot of interesting moves in all of these kind of articulations. At least I find them very interesting. And also, to be quite honest, the way he does it, so we're kind of constantly saying, yeah, here's Jonas, and then there's Merleau-Ponty, and he was way more suave and more. But I would be very happy if in the structure of behavior, Merleau-Ponty sometimes was able to do what Jonas does here in a couple of pages. Like sometimes you break your teeth unnecessarily for some of the things that Merleau-Ponty is doing, and I'm not the one to kind of cry about the style and whatnot, but sometimes it's like, really, Maurice, it's completely unnecessary. And I do have the impression that sometimes he doesn't really know what he's trying to fully articulate. So he's kind of, looking for ways to do it. And I think that with regards to some of the things, Jonas has a way of saying certain things where I would really, really appreciate if Merleau-Ponty did it that way. And I'm pretty sure Jan would be even more appreciative if he did it in the lectures on nature. So there's I'm always trying to kind of make a case for Jonas, not necessarily because I would be a Jonasian myself. And like I said, I have many issues when I read him, but there are also certain things that I actually quite like. I think he's underappreciated with regards to some of the things.
Definitely. Yeah, I want to emphasize then also that I think these writings are beautiful and very, very interesting and valuable to read. Like, for example, in this essay, I found the links that he makes with transcendence, like the transcendence of space and time, and how it links to perception and emotion. I thought they were fascinating links that he makes there. Yeah, I don't know if any of you had any further reflections on that.
I think Ella wanted to comment on something before we go to that.
I just wanted to ask, because I didn't read yet Structure of Behavior, I have to confess, but I'm really interested in the topic, and I'm trying to understand what this deeper logic of perception means for you, because in what way is it deeper? Like, are you saying it's ontologically primary or prior to anything else? Does it have additional insights that you couldn't get through, I don't know, explaining it through some kind of functional forms? Like what is this deeper insight that you're like constantly like kind of just putting it out there, but it's a bit mysterious to me.
Now this is going to be interesting. I want to hear the answers. Let's go.
Yeah, so
whoever wants to chime in.
I could try sketching it a bit. It's what I got from reading Merleau-Ponty's ontology. So it is an ontological approach to perceptual being. So part of what it sketches for me is that we should approach the very things we perceive, so the phenomena themselves, as sort of structures that are present. He calls them hinges. So they sort of, there's structure in them. There's a sort of dimensionality to the things we perceive themselves, and we can't explain them in terms of other things. They themselves are the structures doing the work. So the perceptual field is sort of an operative field. There's a sort of a logic that is animating it from within. And yeah, what I feel is that throughout Merleau-Ponty's late work, he's trying to really express that deep structure of perception, like what it is that makes you. So for example, there's a cup here and I simply see it and I can interact with it. And we can give the whole causal story of light falling into the retina, into the brain, and activating motor receptors and whatever, which will all remain true to an extent. But it will be qualified by this deeper insight that before we give any causal story, there is a sort of there's a lived structure happening whereby the cup is actually present to me, speaking to me as an entity that I can revolve around. And it's fully present in a sort of a cardinal sense. And I think what Merleau-Ponty tries to do is really establish the originality of this realm. It's there before anything else, and it's there in its own authentic self-evidence. And science tends to disfigure that. Science tends to undermine it with its explanations, while I think Merleau-Ponty is trying to again raise it to its original status, its primary status, which is a work that science doesn't do, because science immediately jumps to explaining it. It doesn't stand with the perceived itself to sort of wonder about its true nature.
Okay, but Ella, before you ask questions, trust me, there are different views on this. So let's hear Jan next, and then I'll say something, and then let's continue, because I think that's a really good question, because it's like a very fundamental question. I just want to hear what people have to say, you know, because it's a really good question.
I agree. It's a really good question, and I think I like what Atul was saying. This is pretty accurate. I was just trying to remember some nice quote from the Phenomenology of Perception. There is one place I cannot remember exactly, but he says the stimuli needs to be formed before they enter the consciousness, or something like that. It's kind of completely paradoxical explanation. Usually we think like, okay, there is this one object is moving, hitting the animal, and it produces the perception, right? And then Merleau-Ponty says, well, it's the opposite. Like first there is kind of movement towards the environment, kind of prospective. He's speaking about prospective activity, which means it's both physical movement and kind of expectation, or kind of jumping ahead of time, right? So there is kind of temporal and spatial meaning. So the animal is active in space and time, and that's what makes it possible to even have a stimulus from outside. So it's an opposite logic, right? So there is no stimulus by itself. There is always, let's say, some kind of activity coming from inside the animal or the organism, and there is no stimulus without that. And then we can talk about normativity, right? Later, the authors, like after Merleau-Ponty, they will speak about normativity. So there is no kind of objective world. Everything is based on some perspective. So we are bringing this perspective inside the world, and that's how we are, you know, encountering things as stimuli. So it's a reversal of the logic. But I'm just saying in a complicated way what has been already said. Yeah, so basically the causal explanation of all this perceptual logic is reversed, because we need to have those kind of we need to bring values in the world, and those values will make something become a stimulus for us, right? Does it make sense? I hope so. I'm complicating, saying in a complicated way what Atul explained very nicely. I don't like to refer to too much of a kind of you know, something is given as in a carnal way, or something is kind of it has a meaning, etc. This is still quite obscure if we speak about it like that, because what does it mean that something is given in a carnal way? It's hard to define. So anyway, Sebastian, your turn.
Yeah, I think that the way I would try to articulate it is maybe through what Thais opened up, I think in the first or the second session, when he was referring to the card, and he was talking about the cards, basically 3 modes that he's referring to. So he has this mode of approaching things in a, let's say, mechanistic account, which would be basically a causal account. And if we spread it out, or we're kind of being generous, we might say that this is a scientific account. And then you have an account that takes that draws on the reasons. Yeah, so that there's a rational account. There's an account that is based on reasons and not on causes. And there's this account where you have the mindedness and the body that are just somehow together, and the card says it's there, but he doesn't do anything with it. So basically, in a certain sense, Merleau-Ponty's main contention is if you overlook this particular blind spot, this dark spot over there, you will not be able to correctly understand neither the first sphere nor the other sphere, because this is the sphere where you basically make the switches from one attitude to the other. So if you want to understand how the switching as such happens, how you constitute yourself as something, either as a passive something that is governed by something or something that actively gets involved, where does this attitudinal switch happen? It happens in a certain, let's say, domain, which is, again, an awkward phrase, but it is a domain that can be fleshed out and sketched out. And this domain has a certain dynamic and structure and certain logics to it. And let's say the thing is that it is a domain where you usually have these usually opposite characterizations, such as activity and passivity, coalesce. So what Merleau-Ponty is trying to do, especially in his later work, is basically develop a whole new categorical, conceptual, terminological apparatus that would allow you to think these things in a fresh way, which means that you have to find something that is neither active nor passive, where you have a passive activity or active passivity. So if you speak like that, you're going to end up in contradictions, but that's because in a certain sense, you kind of adopted already this dichotomy, and you've already found yourself in a position where you've overlooked this particular domain. So what Merleau-Ponty is trying to do is do the following. This is how I envision it. With structure of behavior, he takes the scientific road and shows you that you end up with the mind. So you take the most hardcore behavioristic stance, or you might take the cybernetic stance, and you end up with the mindedness. And then you take the opposite position. So you start with experience. And what happens is that you're always thrown outside of experience. By starting with the experience, you're always in the world. So the world is always there, and there's anchorage in the world is there. So you know, he's kind of trying to flesh this out from two different perspectives by taking two extreme views and then showing that regardless of which path you take, you will end up in something like this. So now what he has to do, he has to articulate this domain. And this is where he died.
Yeah, I'm sorry for this detour, but I think, now I understood from your last thing, Sebastian. I mean, I agree with all of these descriptions. Like, my question is like, why would this point, this domain of the middle groundedness, be kind of the origin of the others? Why would it be more primary? And now you said, Sebastian, that like if you start from one side, you get into a contradictions, and if you start from another, you get into contradiction. And possibly, if you would start from this middle ground, I guess you would expect not to get contradictions.
It's a bit of a Hegelian move, yeah. This is a bit of a Aufhebung, but not up, but below.
Yeah. I don't know. I still have a feeling that like you have to still articulate what science is doing, like from this, but what else is it kind of like doing with its activity? I don't know. And that these kind of two domains have to loop into each other and can elucidate each other. So you can have this vivid description of the logic of affectivity and perception, and you can still like try to have, I don't know, mathematical models of it, or try to ground it in how, I don't know, some kind of formal explanations, causal explanations.
Ella, this is awesome. And just very brief, and then Primož, you can chime in. The main problem that I see sometimes with the understanding of perception is it's this pristine something that is, you know, usually it's pre-reflective, pre-verbal, and what have you. But the main idea, the more I kind of think about it, the more I read Merleau-Ponty, it has a certain dimensionality of it, which means that formalization is an integral part of this particular domain as well. And once it enters the picture, it opens up a depth that is not there, that you cannot reduce to certain, let's say, there's this idea that there is a Adamic Lebenswelt, and you can basically reduce all the mathematical truths to that. I don't think that this is the case, because the formalization is another restructuration within this, which opens up new depths, and you get these qualitative shifts where you cannot simply say, well, I can now reduce this to what have you. So let's say, I don't know whether this is truly a Husserlian position or not. There's some debates about this, but for most people, the way they try to introduce the Husserlian Lebenswelt is like, yes, science, because it's so caught up in the formalizations, it overlooks the Lebenswelt, and then somehow the implicit idea is that all the formalizations can be, in a certain sense, drawn back to the Lebenswelt. I think this is a completely mischaracterization. And if you do this, you find yourself in a very, very bad position, because then language, signs, symbols, everything seems to be something that is severed from this Lebenswelt. And you're kind of trying to get to this pre-Adamic, pre-reflective, pre-verbal, pristine, Adamic something. And I don't think this is it, because, it's not about finding a certain pure Adamic state. It's about capturing the dynamism of aliveness, which then manifests itself in different, let's say, vertical layers and patterns and structures and so on and so forth. So it's more about the dynamism than about finding like a certain pristine realm. It's about capturing the logics of this, of the flesh.
I'd just say regarding that, and Husserl, I mean, on the one hand, I don't think it's too, how to put it, one can definitely argue that, that's not what Husserl is doing. It's one thing to sort of recognize that formalization has to, in some way, start from the Lebenswelt, and it's another thing to say that, it has to boil down to the Lebenswelt, so some kind of pure realm of experience. So, I mean, I personally, not that I've spent that much time with reading Husserl, but still didn't really get the impression he was trying to reduce it. But then on the other hand, if you look at his, not just the way he talks about science, but the way he often presents his whole project of transcendental phenomenology, then I'd say that sort of different, more radical interpretation, radical not necessarily in a good way, in a Merleau-Pontian sense, perhaps not radical enough, that's when that interpretation really starts to creep up. Because the way he presents it, you definitely see why it seems like it's getting to some kind of perfect, pristine realm.
So just to try to understand, Ela, what I got is that you're trying to say, why can't we simply tolerate having these two different perspectives, each elucidating the same kind of things from different perspectives and kind of building together? Did I get this approximately right? Like this more phenomenological Merleau-Pontian approach, on the other hand, the more objectivistic approach of science, which is trying to, I don't know, do mathematical models and so forth. And to try to make a Jonasian response to this, I think he would, this is exactly the point he tries to make in the first chapter, that life does not bear this kind of distillation. It's when we come to life and phenomena which are derived from life, it's impossible to simply tolerate having these two different perspectives, different kinds of ways of analyzing the world, because we can't understand life as just from these two separate perspectives. A problem which I think is not as obvious with something like, I don't know, studying a rock from just this phenomenological perspective, or studying a rock in terms of its physics. Whereas with life, also because we are living beings and we are experiencing this aliveness of ours, we can't just tolerate having these polarities of some kind of a more idealistic science and a materialistic science. I think he talks about it in the first essay.
I think also I have a very wide sense of science in mind. Like I have this basically a way of conceptually structuring the world. Like so that in some way that's what science does for me. So it's not like this we're like getting at causes. I mean, you can assign if it has ontological merit or not, but what I would argue science does is like conceptually structure the world using some sort of dynamic, which is and in that way I think it's kind of like productive to think about this sort of conceptual structuring with the type of structuring that an organism does, and to like try to understand how you can maybe, I don't know, what does conceptually structuring mean in relation to organismic structuring, for instance?
Like there's a whole plethora of things that opens up here. What is a concept? Are there like several conceptual ways of structuring the world? How does it relate to a symbol? So yeah, so the first question would of course be, sure, if science is about conceptually structuring the world, aren't there many other ways of conceptually structuring the world? And what exactly does a concept mean in this particular sense? But
yeah, I would agree with Sebastian. Like there would be many different ways how to structure the world. But I was thinking like, well, okay, you can structure the world in various ways. But I would ask you, so where does your research question come from? I think that we have to accept that first there is kind of question, and then you are structuring something, right? You have to be oriented towards something. You have to pick something rather than something else, or you structure left and right, or white and black, etc. You have some criteria for structuring, and this kind of drive or this kind of question that leads you in the structuring, that's something that is preceded, or it's something that precedes all the results of the structuring, even the process of structuring. And that's something that is called perception, I think, within Merleau-Ponty. It's something that it's kind of preliminary, or always presupposed in any kind of structuring, be it scientific or philosophical or something like that. And yeah, so in that sense, the science is blind, towards this, because it presupposes that there is a question or some kind of project.
I mean, you could also argue that the question or the perception itself is, at least in humans, conceptually structured and linguistically structured, and
absolutely.
that in this maybe Fleckian way, say that what comes off as relevant for humans is at least in science, is mostly to do with like mental collectives, right? Or this sort of thought collectives. And I agree that picture needs relevance in this vitalistic sense also, but a large part of the structuring that science assumes that is not just like organismic in this perceptual Merleau-Pontian way, but in a social way, right? So you learn to look through a microscope and to identify relevant things through the microscope, through being to practice science in a community that tells you like what are the standards by which you should measure something and not the other thing, right? It's not like, I don't pre-reflexively know what to look for in a microscope I have to be trained by like a scientific expert, a community, what I should look for, right? So I just think that these two things are assumed in science and they should be explicated. But I think the social part is just as important as this fleshy structure that comes from the body, right?
Yeah, one thing that I would say with regards to this is that from, for example, the perspective of someone like Gasset or Heidegger, so the main problem would be that sciences, just like perception in this awkward Jonasian example, always in a certain sense hides its own origin or forgets its own origin. So it becomes blind to its own origin. So that the question, the thing is that the idea would be, like you said, the sciences will start with a certain domain that you are investigating. But there's a question as to how did this domain came to be and how did it acquire a significance? So this activity of, not already operating within distinctions. So usually science will enter into a realm of distinctions, but it's not interested in the process of distinguishing of distinctions. So how the activity of distinctions occurs. And this is something that Jan was referring to by a question. Question is an interesting something because it opens up a certain domain and it has a certain indeterminate determinacy. What I mean by that is that there are many different ways that you can answer a question, except if it's a no, yes, no question, but you can answer it in different ways, but not innumerable ways. So there are ways that are off, that are not okay, but you cannot fully know how many possible answers there are, because somebody might come up with an answer. You might say, that's a really interesting answer. I would never have come up with that. But I was the one that asked the question. So in a certain sense, I'm opening up a domain which is indeterminate. So I'm kind of creating, a realm of possible distinctions. And then within this realm, we do certain stuff. Now, the question is, what happens when this process unfolds? This is something that science doesn't do, because science will take up something that is then disclosed within this domain, and it will retroactively use these elements to account for the questioning. But it was the questioning that allowed it to even come to be. So this is the interesting thing. It's not about, having a certain level that is above or below. It's about having a dynamism versus a certain static something within which you operate. It is about opening something and about moving within that opening. So this question of opening, the dynamism of opening, is, for example, from the Heideggerian or Gassetian perspective, something that is a blind spot for science, not because it wouldn't be interested in it, but because it is structured in a way where it has to presuppose that in order to be able to function at all. And of course, it can make a story about it, but it will be a story that is always one step downstream, so to speak, because it has to operate within a certain opening, and it cannot then come to the opening of the opening, so to speak. Now, I'm sounding very Heideggerian, but I'm hoping that I'm trying to kind of, you know what I mean? So there's like the birth of distinction. There's the birth of distinction where things become patterned. Yeah, this is something that's interesting. This is how does it occur? So, for example, people like Jonas and Merleau-Ponty would probably say this is something that has to do with aliveness in one way or another, or with perception or what have you. It is something that is overlooked. It has been overlooked. It hasn't been overlooked in the sense of that it has been restructured in certain models, but it hasn't been captured in its dynamism. Yeah, it's like the eye can see itself in the mirror, but not itself as the seeing dynamic. Yeah, it always sees itself as an object. It cannot see itself seeing. Does this make sense? Because the seeing is what allows it for you to even have like a domain of visibility there. So again, it's not about trying to go one step below or what have you. If you're doing that, you're basically making like just a categorical mistake. It's not that vitality is more fundamental as if it's below. It is about capturing the dynamism that is somehow overlooked if you start already with pre-constituted whatever, be it a concept, be it a thing. How does a thing become a thing? How does a concept become a concept? So this would be the path to pursue.
If I get that right, then this middle ground that is opened up here would not oppose itself to science. It would not oppose itself to scientific thinking. It would sort of reintegrate science into an awareness of this dynamism. So it would increase our sensitivity and awareness of what scientific thought is actually doing as it moves and as it pursues its questions.
I would say that science, unlike most of the people or many of the people within an activist community, is actually one of the stellar achievements within this dynamism. So it is something that, you know, is extremely important, that and allows for the level of precision and clarity and the capacity to articulate whatever the domains within which you move in a way which no other approach achieves this. Now we can talk maybe about whether science as it is manifested now, this operationalized reason, as Merleau-Ponty calls it, which is like, you know, a very algorithmic way of looking at things, is science with capital S. I would say that it is not. And I would say that the most people who are defending it would also think in those terms, that, you know, when they speak of science. So this is just, I have a big issue with this. What I feel is to be a growing fetishization of irrationalism through the lens of Merleau-Ponty and Varela. And I think that Varela is more rightfully read in that way. I know him by now, and I see that there are a lot of tendencies in him that go in that direction. I'm not sure what he would do if he were pressed to express himself on this topic. But with Merleau-Ponty, I really don't see it. I really do not see it. And I have huge issues when he is read in that way. So, yeah. But I don't know, maybe Jan will disagree with me on this one.
I couldn't get what you said because of some internet malfunctions. No, seriously.
Okay, so that's good actually then. Yeah, Jan will not censure me. But from what I see, yeah.
One thought
sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I wanted to add one thing, because I think what Ella was pointing out, that okay, the science is also a social thing and it's conceptual, so it's kind of abstract. So what this has to do with life and perception, I think that's a good point. So maybe there's some limitation also in this Merleau-Pontian discourse, or even Jonasian, that we are referring to some kind of life or perception, something corporeal, and so we should maybe allow this kind of dynamism, what Sebastian was describing, also on those social levels and conceptual or abstract symbolic levels, let's say. So I think that's a good thing to kind of remember, that I think in Merleau-Ponty in particular, like when he speaks of perception later, like in the later works, it has really broad meaning. Like it is some kind. This is this sort of question what I was referring to, or interrogation. He also calls it interrogation, and that can be happening on both corporeal level, but also in the symbolic domain, on the social level, etc. So we should understand this life dynamic very broadly. We shouldn't exclude all the symbolic activities from that. That's something I wanted to add, maybe to make it clear that I agree with what Ella pointed out. Like we shouldn't limit this to just do some sensorial stuff.
No, I actually, yeah, I would also agree with that particular thing. I think that in the human perception is symbolic. I wouldn't necessarily call it conceptual, because conceptual has a very specific undertones, but I wouldn't mind it if we qualify the notion of conception. That's why I asked Ella, it's a difficult, you might say, yes, it's conceptual, but, if you say Kantian conceptual, then I wouldn't agree. But if it's something like, something that is embedded in these structurations, patternings of certain sort, then for sure, this is something. And that this is deeply and profoundly related to the domain of social in human beings, that's also indisputable. When I was reading this particular chapter, what I found interesting is, how the level of freedom rises the more, in a certain sense, capricious your being is. And with animals, it kind of becomes even more so, because you're no longer directly embedded into the source of nourishment. So there's like this opening up of a space and time, and there is like a new level of precariousness. And with human beings, it's even more so. Not only is it related to the world, but to other beings, and in a way that's like really, really, really integral. Yeah. So you have another flip of this dependency, which allows then for a new jump in the freedom. So there's a further domain of radical dependency that needs to happen, where you're radically dependent on the others, not only on the precariousness of the world, but precariousness of the others. And this allows for another shift. I find this very interesting. I think that this is the birth of the symbolic in the domain of intersubjective.
There's also with humans the precariousness of the self, because you start to think about yourself and relate to yourself and mediate your own idea of yourself, and this idea is never stable in a certain sense. So I think with humans it goes even to this level, because in the social sense, I guess we could also talk about some kind of precariousness even on the animal level. I would say with humans the real accentuation is this rift and mediation with oneself, and I think that would be an interesting path to explore, but I'm not sure how much does Jonas talk about humans specifically in the coming essays.
Can't remember. I think he goes in that direction. I think that he will tackle a lot of this stuff, basically. Most of the things that we're now going through. No, but it's good because, we're kind of doing it from different perspectives. And for me, what was very, very interesting in Jonas is, like, I jotted down several things. We weren't able to get to any. But this one is maybe somewhat related, so maybe somebody could say some things on this. I found it, that he puts it, he says that what you get is an enhancement of selfhood in this process that he's kind of trying to depict. So in this domain of mediacy, yeah, there's an enhancement of selfhood. But I find it interesting that there's a growth in the selfhood in proportion to how ecstatic you are as a being. So the more you have of the world, the more there is outside, the more you are, in a certain sense, a self. Which is kind of, you're not really going inward. The more you're kind of spreading out, the bigger the increase in individuality. So I don't know. This I found very interesting. This idea. Not sure what you think of it.
Totally agree. I remember there is one one essay by Gabriel Marcel. He describes this wonderfully. Like you say, oh, this object is mine, you know, and this is like simultaneously establishing you as a self and the outside world. You know, it's a kind of mutual structuration. I don't remember the title of the essay, but it's Gabriel Marcel. And so that is, I think I wanted to add something similar to after what Primož said. The self is kind of reflection of the structured world, right? More complex the world, the more stable or more distilled is the self. That's how I see it. I hope this is what Sebastian wanted to say. I think that this is how I understood. At least.
Yeah, it is. For me, it has another layer, which I also maybe thought that we were going to touch upon, but there won't be time. It would be too far off. But it has to do with the Buddhist philosophy, yeah, and the structuration of the self, and basically how there's a very interesting story in Buddhist philosophy about self being a process of self-making or self-structuring, yeah. And the idea is that suffering is related precisely to the domain of having this process of what you were now describing, Jan, as unfolding. Yeah, it's here that happens. And basically, Jonas is a marvelous addition to that, because he literally spells out how you get all these different things, such as, you know, he talks about how greed develops, and then how aversion develops, fear develops, and basically within Buddhist tradition, you have three main poisons are called, or three main defilements are greed, aversion, and illusion. These are the three main defilements that are crucially interrelated to the problem of suffering. And here you have like this very interesting account that kind of spells out on the level of life what is the external dynamics of it, and also how the self gets created. And unfortunately, we cannot go into this, but for me personally, that's a very interesting conversation to be had potentially with regards to these things. Yeah, but anyway, I think Adnan wanted to say something before.
Yeah, I think it's also maybe tangentially related to what you were saying right now about Buddhism, insofar as that, of course, has to do with the whole dynamic of dependence and independence. Because, of course, another thing that's interesting is that, you know, practice in the Buddhist sense, but rather in other traditions as well, is at least described in terms of a striving towards independence, which is also probably interesting here. But one thing that I found strange, and that maybe speaks to the fact that the very notion of dependence or independence might be somehow ambiguous or sort of dialectical in a sense, in the way we sort of think of it. When he talks about plants as being superlatively independent, that really struck me as strange, because, you know, it's not. Of course, I see what he means. I see why he uses that term, because they can synthesize their own nutrition. Yeah, sure, but you know, if you stand next to it long enough and, you know, have it be in the shade, it's going to die. It's not terribly independent. It's not what you typically think of as being independent. So, you know, in a way, that seems odd. Although, on the other hand, you also can't say that higher animals who have all those needs of nutrition and, you know, going out and doing things, you also can't say that those are independent either. So that's something that I found interesting.
Mm-hmm. It is interesting, yeah. But
I think Lesnar actually makes the opposite point, that plants are entirely dependent. They're dependent, not independent part of the life circle. Yeah, that's an interesting point.
no, but you're correct, Adnan. I mean, he does use it in two different ways, and I'm not sure whether this is a problem that he was just not careful enough to differentiate between, say, freedom and independence, because he even talks about freedom in one context with regards to inanimate matter, where he's tackling precisely this question somewhere around 102 and 103. This is where this particular instance occurs that you mentioned. So I think that he's just being very sloppy here terminologically, in the sense of you have independence in the sense of autonomy or freedom that is characteristic for the living being, and then independence in the sense of as he says, like safety and stability. So a guaranteed, easy way. You know, plants are in a certain sense the ideal mode of being of a modern American libtard. Yeah. So they would say, yeah, that's a very independent. I want to have this independent. I want to just be plugged to things and have any met what I have that I have met immediately. Yeah. So for them, that would be an independence. But if we're being honest, like there's a different type of independence, which is a very dependent independence. It's interesting what he's saying here. Yeah, that in a certain sense you have to kind of forego a certain safety and this strong direct link to what enables your survival for you to gain a different possibility of fight. Like you said, Adnan, that's a really good example. So you stand next to a plant and in a certain sense it withers and dies. So, you know, on the one hand, it has all the nutrients constantly, but it doesn't really have a flexibility or capacity to really establish new ways of asserting its independence. But there, if you kind of allow yourself this precariousness and going out on the limb and out of the realm of safety, you establish a different type of safety, which is kind of broader in scope in many ways.
That's essentially the difference between the safety of how to put it, of forbearance, of being able to handle things, versus the safety of a safe space, in a sense.
I mean, also I think in biology it's problematic to imagine, like it's not linearly, like you can just say, you know, plants this and then plants and animals are like different, you know, branches of life. And so you have, in biology, you have like heterotrophs and autotrophs. Autotrophs are the beings that can produce organic compounds by themselves, so plants and some bacteria. But you also have like fungi, which cannot move, which are not motile, and they cannot produce, they cannot photosynthesize. So they usually live off as parasites or as or in symbiosis with other beings, that like with plants, with trees usually, or with or they kind of feed on the ground, sort of by ingesting some enzymes and also getting organic compounds from there. But it's interesting, I think, it's just there's no like very clear-cut structural hierarchy when you take a look at like taxonomy and life. You just have like different ways of like different forms of life, and it's hard to like really say, oh, this one is independent and this one is dependent. Like they're just different forms of life.
Well, precisely, Plesner, Jonas would try. I'm assuming they would push you on this. Yeah, they would say, yeah, that's definitely a biological doctrine nowadays, and we've all been taught this particular thing when you go through the educational school. So they're just different life forms. For them, there's a different story to be said. So they would want to claim that, of course, you've had like these changes that have happened through the course of evolution, but these changes were interesting in way how life kind of did a certain something with it. Yeah, so it acquired a certain jump that it's inherent to it. That's Jonasian position for sure. Plessnerian also to a certain degree. So there's like a certain movement within life that has these jumps, and then you have jumps, and this higher jump is more life than the other for Plessner. It kind of the logic of life has unfolded itself one step further. He would not agree with this. He would say, yeah, I mean, I understand that this is how biologists are doing their thing, but you know, they're also having like it's a very specific way of already approaching this, that you're just going to say, well, you know, there's like, because look, if there's no teleology, then sure. But if you're going to say that there is a teleology, then you can say something else, and that's his main premise. Yeah? So basically saying biologists now say that this is the case. Well, biologists have been trained to look at phenomena in a very specific way, and they basically have no room whatsoever for teleology. So they're not going to try to make a story between vegetables, fungi, and between plants, fungi, and animals. For them, this is like an outdated question. This is a non-question. So if you say something like this, yeah, this is like something that we all do. Yeah, this is something we did in the past when we were still kind of doing the magical thinking.
I really don't think that this is a question that is over in biology. Like,
no,
I mean, I don't know, maybe in different ways. I mean, I also agree that you can talk, maybe cognition is a good like term for like this evolvement, right? And talking about plant cognition versus animal cognition, but you still have like some fundamental principles, okay, of life in both of them. But even like the hated, in this group, hated approaches of genomics and transcriptomics and all that, I mean, you're basically trying to see how things change, right? And you can find like similar mechanisms in like vastly different kingdoms and life forms.
Okay, but one thing here, and then Jan, you have to say something about this. So, for instance, there's this very common claim. I mean, I'm not disputing the claim. I'm absolutely accepting that this is true from the genetical point of view or what have you. That there is this enormous similarity between, say, human beings and apes, and not only human beings, but also, say, certain mammals. And there's just like this minute difference in the genomic structure. And for some reason, you know, this is always understood, regardless of the percentage or what have you, to say that, well, you see, we think we're so different, but yet we are so similar. But another way of looking at it would be like the tool that you're using clearly does not see the crucial distinctions. So what the heck are you on about? Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is you can always have this claim made, but you can look at it from two different perspectives. In the books, because there's like a very strong consensus and it has good reasons and arguments, and we know about them and so on and so forth. The reasoning goes that, you know, there is like a similarity that we don't see, and basically we're almost the same. The counter argument would be you're simply using the wrong tool to see the differences. Your tool is lacking. So, you know, this is the same as with neuroscience. And for example, you have the same brain pattern for anxiety and depression. They're the same disease. No, you're just using the wrong tool. You're unable to differentiate between two fundamentally different things. And now we have to kind of presuppose that they're basically the same thing. And then the concept, like the related argument is, if you give antidepressants, you respond to them both in a similar manner, and we know in which direction that particular argument went recently. So you know? But anyway, go on.
I actually don't know in which direction that argument went recently, and I would like to know. But just I think also in biology, I think it's like any kind of reification of like a certain part of science, just saying like that's how it is. It's like, I don't know, like even in like we decoded the human genome and everybody was like, oh, now we're gonna cure all the diseases, and of course they're not, because the complexity of the organism like goes genome, and then you have like transcriptome and proteome, and just like goes like this, like exponentially up. And we're only talking here still about molecules. So there's like layers and layers and layers of like forms and complexity that comes, right?
Yeah.
I think like good science would not like stop there, right? Or shouldn't stop there. And I don't think it does.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe a stellar science doesn't, but unfortunately, like the less stellar science does. And it does so in a way that has very significant consequences, not only for the scientific community, but the socio-political and cultural community at large as well. And this I have issues with, big time. And whenever you press them on this, they will say, yeah, but we don't really think that. Well, then why is it like spread all over, and why do you publish it in your pop sci books? And I can show you the quotes. So, you know, you mentioned Flick. Flick has a really, really cool way of accounting for this. He would say that every scientist is working in a very specific field, and that particular field, that is his domain. And he is well aware how problematic it is to say anything categorically within that field. However, outside of that field, he's not a specialist, and he's basically consuming literature and listening to talks and lectures and what have you that are way more generic. So he's developing like these nice schemas and neat structures outside of that field. And in many levels, he's just like the rest of us. He's consuming pop sci. So he's creating this conglomerate of things. And what happens is that if you press him on something that he's doing, he will say, well, you know, I'm perfectly aware that I cannot say anything categorically. But at the same time, he's going to publish a pop sci book that is going to make like, well, claims like 1,000 years ago, philosophers were arguing about whether this, well, luckily science in the past 10 years or something like that. So
yeah, I think there might be some network issues here.
You guys censored. The scientists got onto us.
Yeah.
We've gone too far. We should take a screenshot of Sebastian's picture here. The last moments of Sebastian.
Yeah, because it's so
He
dark.
looks like he's happily falling asleep, no?
Looks like it's from a music video or something.
The cover of his next death metal album.
Or we? What do you think?
I guess we can kind of go on, right? And he chimes back in.
I mean, he just left now, so he should be rejoining soon. Because, you know, obviously he figured out that something has gone awry.
I had a bunch of thoughts in the past half an hour, but at least one of them was to make a case for the plants here. We're looking at individual plants, but I think if we look at plants embedded in a forest or trees, then there's a lot more independence at play in the sense of freedom, not just static independence. If you look at mycelium networks that connect roots and the way they're able to respond to changes in the climate, I think there's a much more dynamic freedom there to be seen. But then again, you know, so on the one hand, I think the distinction between the the human and the animal and the plant isn't that black and white if we really consider them in their complexity. But at the same time, there is definitely a valid distinction to be drawn between the two. So this made me feel like these authors like Jonas and Plessner, they make me feel as a human being. They seem to instill again a sense of being human is unlike anything else, which is a sort of a narrative that has been undermined by science in general over the past few decades, or maybe even centuries. So they seem to reinstill a sort of a sense of there is something very unique and remarkable about being human. And on the other hand, I feel like if I go along with thoughts like what Ela is raising and what some of these discussions are raising, there's a value in also seeing the sort of embeddedness of the human in the larger ecosystem and seeing how the splits aren't that black and white and how there's a lot more continuity if we consider the whole. It makes me feel a bit like it's a duck rabbit situation. Like I can switch between these two perspectives now, one according to which as a human being I am something quite remarkable, and the other according to which I am just one of a whole plethora of life. And maybe this is another one of these dualisms where the truth lies somewhere in the middle. These are just an integration of a bunch of reflections of the past half an hour.
But I guess in a certain sense, what sets you as a human apart as something special is this exact ability to be thinking about this in this certain sense. To be able to even conceive this idea of, on the one hand, being separate, and on the other hand, to artificially reintegrate yourself into the nature from which you were, as Jonas puts it, set apart from, but with the rift that perception and all that stuff creates. And I think that this is the, at least I can speak for Pless, I think, this is why you might get this idea that he kind of thinks humans are something very special, is because of this very ability, which in the end leads us to even be able to do objective science, because we are aware of how our subjectivity is and how we as a species are linked with everything that we are studying. And this is what gets this critical distance, but also what this critical distance is what gives the human the, I guess, the privileged position in terms of doing science.
Terribly sorry for the dramatic.
It was staged.
Intentionally.
Science is over.
Yeah, those big signs coming out to get you.
Present Sebastian is a clone. The original one has been taken out.
My router kind of, how do you say it in English? It just collapsed temporarily or something. I've already had this happen. I don't know what's going on. My owner was here and tried to, but yeah, I lost the mojo, so I can't redo it. I was in the zone, not able to do it again.
We were about to solve the problem, and now it's gone.
Yeah.
The Merleau-Ponty of your life.
There's an interesting parallel in my story in my elementary school which involved a psychoactive substance, and me being this close to getting it. And by getting it, the best way I can phrase it is like understanding the riddle of everything. And I had it, and then my friend asked me something and I lost it, you know? It was one of the most frustrating things that happened to me in the elementary school. Probably contributed to the fact why I became a philosopher.
This is good material for a short story.
Jan, I'm going to tell you this story when I'm in the Czech Republic in greater depth.
I'm just gonna remember that for the eventual biography.
jot it down. So okay, I definitely will not be able to finish what I started. So shall we maybe wrap this up, or would somebody like to add something?
I think we can wrap it up.
It was a lively discussion. We didn't really get to almost any things that I've jotted down, maybe some other points. But it was good. Yeah. So yeah, then see you in 2 weeks, right?